So I'm going to go ahead and start. And again, there's really quite a few new faces in here today that weren't necessarily in here yesterday, which is great. Again, these 3 sessions, yesterday, today, and Friday, are meant to build upon each other, but they also stand alone. So it's perfectly okay for you to attend or not attend, however your interest warrants. So again, my name is Chan Hellman, and I'm a professor in the Department of Human Relations here, which is a Norman-based program. Please, there's food back there too, if you're interested. So I'm a quantitative psychologist, as I mentioned yesterday, by training. When I do teach, it's usually research methods, statistics courses. And this week's series is focused on reliability and validity. And today, in particular, we're going to focus on finding and evaluating measures from that standpoint. So yesterday was sort of a little bit more lecture style, for those of you who were here. Today it'll be much more sort of hands-on process. And really, taken together, all 3 of these sessions, my main objective for this was it to be skill-driven. So today, and then certainly next, or on Friday, will be much more interactive with you using the computer and looking at things. So today's primary topic is finding and evaluating measures. So once you've identified the topic of interest, from yesterday's lecture, the construct of interest, we are going to do a literature review to be able to see what work has been done in that field, but also in terms of how people are measuring the variables that they assess. So it's the idea of finding potentially what the gold standard measures are being used in that particular field, and then whether or not you can access them, and then for you to be able to look at a few indicators of the psychometric qualities, that is the validity and reliability estimates that are connected to that measure. Okay? So you should have access to a couple of articles. So the Stress Among Fathers article and the Hope article. Again, I think Shelley was just getting ready to send out for some of you who don't have access. Do you guys not? Can you? Should be in your email at this point. Yeah. So again, it'll take you a few seconds to pull it up, but we'll connect you to that. What I'd like for you to do is just, if you remember yesterday, we were talking about score reliability, and one of the things I made the comment to is that reliability estimates are about the scores obtained from a measure, not from the scale itself. And the same is true with validity. And what we mean by validity, once again, and that is the accuracy of the interpretation of scores obtained from an article. So for instance, if I'm measuring trust in physicians, right? So it's a construct, we've assessed trust, and we get a score. For us to be able to say that a person has a level of trust or has low, moderate, or high, what is the extent to which that is an accurate indicator of that individual? That's what I mean by validity, okay? And so we're going to talk about a few of those types of indicators today. So on this Stress Among Fathers, if you have it with you, paper, or if you've got it pulled up on the computer, what I really would like for you to do is simply go to the methods section of that paper. In particular, actually, it'll be on page 317. Okay? 317. Okay? So we're going to look under the methods section. There will be a subsection called measures. It may also be called instruments. But let's say that we were interested in how somebody is measuring parenting stress. right? So we see that the variable that they're indicating, pediatric parenting stress, and we can read through there. And first of all, the thing that we see is that it was assessed using the Pediatric Inventory for Parents. Do you see that? The PIP. And that gives us the citation, Streisand et al. Now, what we could do if we decide this is a particular scale we want to look into is we would just do a literature search on Streisand et al. We would go find that scale and see if they actually present it in the article. Now, just a couple of things. Again, this is meant to be introductory. So the idea is sometimes authors will present the scale in a journal article, right? They'll present the scale either in appendix or actually in the document or itself. Or if you read through the article, it may indicate the scale is available from the first author, right? So it tells us sort of how to access the scale. What you really want to pay attention to is whether or not they're telling you that you can't use the scale. So some measures were developed for proprietary reasons, right? Now, I will tell you as a psychologist in academia, I'm actually not a big fan of that. I think we should give away our science. That's just my own moral compass on that. But however, we also know that a lot of people are creating scales that we have to purchase, right? However, one of the things that I would like for you to recognize is that if it is presented in a paper, right, like a published paper, right? As you guys all know, when we publish, we sign over copyright ownership to the editor or to the journal, right? Now, we could get the librarians in here to talk about how we can adjust those agreements so that we maintain ownership of them. But basically what we're looking for is whether or not there's any language in the article that says we cannot use it. Otherwise, it's fair use. That is, any of us can use it, right? If you can't find the article, my recommendation is to email the first author, right? And their email is going to be listed, and then just ask them about it. Even if it's a scale that is proprietary, especially if you're a student, a graduate student, oftentimes the authors will allow you to use it for free, right? What they're really wanting to make sure is that you're not making money off of their instrument, okay? So I've had a number of master's and doctoral students who reach out and they've been authorized to use instruments for free, which is fantastic, right? Nevertheless, pediatric parenting stress, this section tells you what scale they're using, right? The PIP, and that it's by Streisand et al. And then they tell you about a little bit about the scale. In particular, some of the things we're interested in is the response format, and here it says they use a 5-point Likert type format and blah, blah, blah. What I want you to do is go all the way down to the bottom of that section. And do you see the very last sentence? In the sample, the internal consistency was excellent. And then they present the Greek symbol alpha equal 0.95. So yesterday at the end of the discussion, we talked about different ways to present that. So alpha represents the internal consistency reliability estimate, right? That is the consistency of how people respond to the items. And we indicated yesterday that a value of 0.70 or higher is acceptable. So this is just a pretty nice indication that the reliability estimates are pretty good. And if we're interested in using this, we will go search for Streisand to find the actual instrument, okay? But just to keep going, the next variable, the child behavior, right? So you can see that they're using the iBerg Child Behavior Inventory. Again, they give the reference to that. We could go do a search. And again, at the bottom of that section, they give the Greek symbol alpha equal 0.90. Okay? So all I really want to demonstrate from this particular article is where to find, how they're using the measure, what measure they're actually citing, how we might go about finding that, and then preliminary psychometric information, which is reliability estimates that they obtained. We talked yesterday about meta-analysis and the fact that that's gathering all published articles. There's another approach to that called reliability generalization, and essentially it's the same as meta-analysis. You get all published studies using a measure, and then you statistically analyze the reliability estimates, right? And so what we know from doing those types of studies, for instance, I've done one with HOPE, the adult HOPE scale. And what we found is that 300 published articles have used that instrument, but only 90 of those 300 articles reported score reliability, right? What I'm getting at is that most articles don't report those psychometric estimates, even though it's a requirement by the APA publication manual and the AMA publication manual. I just want you to know that most times, majority of the times, these estimates aren't reported, which is not good, right? Especially since score reliability is sample specific, meaning it changes from sample to sample. Okay? So any questions on this? Yes. So it's really a trend. The report came out from the American Psychological Association in 1998. All of the test and measurement books will tell you that it's a requirement, and they also highlight that it's about scores, it's not tests. It's just that the culture in training has not become pervasive yet. And almost all the top tier journals will now require it, just as not all journals will you guys don't experience this maybe so much in engineering, but for instance, in most of the social and behavioral science journals, we're actually becoming more and more required to say that we have IRB approval. You know, that this protocol was approved by our Human Subject Protection Agency. Not all of them are doing that yet, but they're getting there. So just most people who are doing research don't necessarily recognize that reliability is about scores, not the tests. So they still talk about tests being reliable when that's not an accurate statement. So what she's asking about is if they're not actually studying individuals, but they're comparing the measures, and so do they report some of the various information? There are many different types of reliability, like parallel forms is one that we're not really going to talk about in here, and that's when we perhaps create a, let's say that there's an existing measure for HOPE, and it's a 30-item measure. Well, I develop a measure of HOPE, and it's a 5-item measure. Well, which one as a researcher would you prefer to use? A 30-plus item or a 5-item measure? Well, most of us want to use fewer and fewer items because it makes the survey more efficient. So what we can actually do is compare our instrument to the longer instrument to determine if it's measuring the same thing with parallel types of forms. So it may be that they are conceptually or theoretically comparing articles. So for instance, HOPE, the way that I study it, is a cognition. The way that Hirth, who's a nurse in the Hirth HOPE scale, she defines it as an emotion. And so we can compare those two theoretical definitions. Right. So if I collect 60 articles that have been published on HOPE, then I actually statistically analyze all of those articles. So those articles become the primary data, and I'm doing secondary analysis on that data. Yeah. Right? So just real quickly, what I want to show you is this next article that we pulled up, and this is the Will and the Ways Development Validation. And this one that I sent out actually has highlights in it. So you should have a version where certain things are highlighted. And that's for efficiency so that we don't have to go through a 20-page article line by line for me to show you stuff. But this is an article that would be very common in the social and behavioral sciences, where they present the development of a new scale. So you'll see it's development and validation of a measure of hope, right? So I just want to highlight several things that we may want to pay attention to. So in the previous article, the authors referred to the PIP scale, and I can't remember the authors that they referenced, and I indicated we could go to that Simmons et al. Article, and it would be like this, okay? It would be the actual presentation of the development and validation. So this is something we would be looking for. So the first thing that I want to highlight, we'll just go through this and look at the highlights, okay? So the first highlight is in the abstract, right? And that is, when we talked yesterday about the operationalization process, this is the first step of that. That is, it's the definition of the construct. They are actually defining what they mean by hope. So that's the first thing we want to look for is, how are they defining? What does it mean? Right? The second one, which is in the first line of that left side, begins to introduce why hope is important, right? And so that's just kind of what we're looking at is, okay, well, what has it been shown to predict? Okay. If you go to page 571, the next page, where the first real paragraph, it starts off, the two components of hope are reciprocal. Do you see that? That is telling us the dimensions of the construct. So if you remember yesterday's conversation, those of you that were here, we talked about operationalization as starting with the definition and then how many dimensions might exist. Is it a global measure, or does it have many different facets that it's measuring? So again, these are just little tidbits that I'm looking for real quickly, okay? So as we begin to define the construct, right, the next phase that we're interested in is, what should hope predict? That is, people who score high on hope should behave differently than people who score low on hope, right? And so if you'll see on that next column over there, it says, having briefly highlighted the similarities of these concepts, it may be blah, blah, blah to contrast. What they are doing is they're setting up the argument for validity, right? Setting up the argument for validity. If hope is important, then it should be related to certain things, and it should be unrelated to other things. So it's a theoretical proposition that they're going to test, okay? Which is the testing the validity. Okay so far? All right, let's go to the next page, 572. Okay, the section that I have highlighted is, it says scale development and validation. They're actually going to walk you through the process they use. So they started out with 45 items, and they ultimately ended up with a 12-item or an 8-item scale. So basically, they're just telling you how they went through that process. Okay. And then what I also have highlighted is how people are supposed to respond. So what's the response format? Okay. Because if we're going to use this scale, we want to use it in a similar fashion. We want to use the same response format. All right, the next column, and I'll get through this pretty quickly now. You'll see the reliability, section on reliability indexes. Yeah. And now you're starting to see the Cronbach's alpha. And then right below that is test retest. So again, they're establishing reliability estimates from the measure. So real quickly, we'll just go to the next page, 573, under the section of validity. So you can see what they're doing in the article. They've developed the scale, and now they're going to test the reliability, which we just covered. The next sections are estimating its validity with other constructs. Okay, and I won't go through those, but you can actually see where I've highlighted where they reported in the introduction where I said this is where they're setting up the argument for validity of what hope should be related to. So they talked about optimism and self-efficacy. So what I've got highlighted here on page 574 is actually whether or not it was. So they actually tested that proposition. And again, if you just kind of scan through that, you're going to see different. We just talked about convergent validity. The next is discriminant validity. And then page 577 at the bottom is just the summary statement of that. So a really long article. So one of the goals of a scientist doing publications, this is kind of a joke, is why say something in a single paragraph when you can say it in 5 or 10 pages, right? Right. So basically that one paragraph pretty well sums it up, right? So, and then you'll just see that it's to the end that I have things kind of highlighted where again they summarize what they found. At the on page 583, which is right before the references, and so I've kind of skipped forward quite a bit there. I'll give you a second to scroll down to it. Are you there? Where I've got it highlighted. Basically, it's just saying, based upon all this data, it appears to be a useful construct. But they also highlighted the health-related stuff because it's kind of interesting to me being on this campus where we have Norman-based programs as well as health science center programs, kind of thing. And then the final thing is that at the very end of this article, in the appendix, they actually present the scale. Okay, so we started with this idea that we were interested in a concept. We do a literature review, find an article, go to the methods section, go to the measures, find where they've used it, some preliminary information, see that they've used whatever measure, then we go in and do a deeper view of that actual article and we can critique real briefly. We don't have to read the whole thing. We don't have to be statisticians necessarily, but do they have some pretty good indicators of validity and reliability? Is it worth using this instrument? Now, one other way to do that is you're looking through your literature review, and let's say that you're interested in this concept of hope. Those of you who have done research, especially students doing theses and dissertations or working with other folks, have written a literature review, right? I mean, how long does it take before you recognize that you're reading the same name over and over again? Or that is, everybody is referencing this person and their work, right? So pretty soon with the measures, it's the same thing. Everybody seems to be using this measure, right? And so if I'm conducting a study and I'm interested in a concept, I don't want to use an obscure measure, or I don't want to develop my own if there's one that is so widely known and respected in the field, because when you go to publish that, all you're doing is inviting the reviewers and the editors to say, why did you do that? We don't have confidence in your measure when we've got this one. And I've got to tell you, as a person who does statistics, this happens to me all the time. People will come to me with a study where they've developed their own measure, and they have made it so much harder than doing that on the front end. Just, if you're interested in a construct, find out how other people are measuring it and do the same thing. It just makes life so much easier, right? Okay. So just that was kind of hands-on. The next thing I would like for you to do is to actually, let's go ahead and find a couple of measures. Let's walk through that process. Does anybody have any questions so far? So something just popped in my mind, something I get all of the time. Let's say, and because I do so much work in the nonprofit world, let's say that we found this measure and it's a let's say a 10-item scale to measure stigma. I'll stay with that, right? So the question is, do you have to use all 10 items? Right? And you know, when I'm with a group of people, they say, well, but it's already validated. It's a valid scale. And so you can't take items away from it because it's a valid scale, right? Remember, it's not about the scale, it's about the scores obtained from a measure. So by taking items out, are you changing the construct? That's really the question being asked. So if I have 10 items to measure one construct, could I not do that with 3 or 4 or 5 items? And the answer is, all you need to do to make sure is that the items that you're using are representative of the construct. Okay? Do those 5 items that you're going to choose to use out of a 10-item scale adequately capture the definition of the construct? And all I'm talking about right there is face validity. Okay? It's a concept that you've all heard, I'm sure, face validity, and that is, do the items represent the construct? Okay? So it's not an easy answer, but I do get it all the time, right? If you've got a really long survey and you're trying to get it shorter for time, that's the deal. Now, when you publish that, or when you see articles that are published, how you'll see it is we used Snyder's Hope Scale, and we used a reduced number of items. And that's all you have to say. We used 5 items instead of 8, and here's our score reliability. Yeah, I mean, to a point, most of the time, you know, oftentimes we'll say, you know, why don't people report score reliability, you know, in articles? And, you know, is it because they don't know any better? Well, sometimes journals, many of you know this, have a fairly finite number of words they allow you to use, you know, and sometimes it's a number of characters, right, if it's an abstract or something along those lines. So what do you put in and what do you take out, right? And so, you know, if the big part of your study is about the relationship between hope and well-being, you don't want to spend a majority of your writing talking about how you measured hope. You're really interested in that relationship. So it's just kind of a balance of how much you write, what you write. But you want to be as descriptive as possible so that somebody could actually replicate what you did. I've conducted studies with where we actually forgot to put in a couple of items. We used a 4-item scale instead of the 6 that it was developed for, just pure accident. And we, you know, so you just write in there, we used 4 items of the 6-item scale. And, you know, the question is, do the items represent the construct? That's the real answer. That's correct. Yeah. So in that second article, there was the 2 dimensions of pathway and agency is what she's referring to. If I'm only interested in pathways, then I don't need to use the agency questions. Yesterday, I drew up on the board the commitment construct, and there was affective, normative, and continuance. If you're only interested in affective, you don't have to measure normative and continuance. You know, so why not use the 8-item scale instead of the 18-item scale if you're really only interested in part of it? So absolutely. Absolutely. So, okay. Okay. So again, we'll get into the library. So I know some of you are Norman-based programs and some of you are Health Science Center programs, so get to your respective libraries electronically. For the Norman-based programs, electronically, we'll go to the Bazell Library in Norman. For HSC, I don't know what you do. I don't know if you do Tulsa or you just log into the other one. Before I forget, I would like to announce that before Friday, we will actually email you a database, an SPSS database. And it'll be data that I've collected. But on Friday, we're actually going to, I'll walk you through SPSS on how to do reliability analysis or create scales so you can assess reliability and validity estimates. So it'll be a lot more hands-on, a little bit more statistical in nature, okay? So just, if you don't have SPSS on your computer, when you get this email and try to open it, it won't open. You'll have to wait till you're in here probably to do that. So. All right, so are you at your respective libraries? So ultimately what I want to look at is I'm going to databases and e-reference. Again, I don't know what Health Science Center looks like. Ultimately, what I want to get to is EBSCO host. Or I'm sorry, EBSCO host or EBSCO collection. For ease, I'm just selecting all databases. How many of you are familiar with EBSCO? I'm not sure how you guys do with engineering, right? So EBSCO collection is a database. It's a host of database, 50 different databases, I believe, that we can search. And each of those individual databases have their own, like Academic Search Elite has access to, looks like, full text for more than 2,100 different journals. So it's just different ways. You would actually want to look through there to see which ones you really want. But again, just for ease, I'm just selecting all of those. All right. And I'm going to click on scholarly peer-reviewed journals. That'll keep me from getting Time Magazine or People Magazine or non-scholarly access. Now, when I teach this in my classes, I actually get accused of going way too fast. So I'm trying to go relatively slow, but we're also on a bit of a time crunch. So. So the one construct that stands out to me from our conversation yesterday was your interest in stigma. Is that right? So I'm just going to go ahead and play with that if that's okay. So I'm going to type in stigma on the search field, but I'm going to put it in the title. So you can see that we've got roughly 15,000 articles with stigma in the title. I'm not overly interested in going through 15,000 articles. Can you tell me a little bit more about stigma?
It's stigma for seeking therapy for
mental health?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'm going to go back to my search and I'm going to do stigma and mental illness. And I want to put both of those in the title. So we should reduce that fairly significantly. So now we have 1,300 articles. Again, I'm not interested in going through 1,300 articles, but I noticed this first article, again, we're seeing some psychometric properties. And I'm just going to click on this one, stigma, a unique source of distress for family members. And it says academic journal. So we've pulled up the article. Now, all I'm doing is going through the same process that we walked through with the two articles that I handed out. I want to see how they're defining stigma. And again, I could read through that, but what I'm going to get to first is the measures. Okay, so it looks like there's stigma-related experiences are through this ECI. And then, do what?
Sorry, I'm reading.
Oh, okay. And then it looks like it's more of American Medical Association's writing style, so they're giving us the references in numeric format, which we'd have to go find in the back. Those two styles are different in the way that they present. So again, here I'm finding kind of how they assess it. It looks like it's got 10 subscales. I don't see any information about reliability as it's presented here. But let's follow what Jessica said, and I'll go to 15. And you'll see here they reference the development of an inventory. So now we can go get that article and do the psychometric assessment to see if it's measuring what we're really interested in. Now there's going to be many different stigma scales. So we just have to, again, it's due diligence, go through and find out how people are doing it. If we do our literature review, again, we're going to see the same names pop up. We'll see that people are measuring it the same. If you guys are all familiar with the scientific method and the deductive side of that, right? It starts with theory, right? Again, this is the quantitative side of life. Starts with theory, hypothesis, or literature review, hypothesis. So that literature review, we would already kind of know what the names are and who are the players in this field, okay? And I think actually, Heather, you're going to be talking a lot more about that during your session.
Yes.
Is the scientific method. So in a couple of weeks or a month,
About a month.
yeah, the next series of these research events will take place. So, are there any questions so far? Okay. So we're coming on about 5 minutes before I want to wrap up. Is there any other scale? I'll give you I'll kind of throw myself under the bus. So I know we have a medical informatics person here, and when I heard medical informatics, I was like, oh, okay. So when I think about the health exchange, medical record exchange idea, and I know that that's not completely tied to you, but this idea of an exchange that exists where the medical professions in a region or an area can access the same medical records. So for instance, if I'm experiencing chronic kidney stones, for instance, and yesterday or 2 days ago, I went to my primary care physician because I have a pain. They do an x-ray, right? And it looks like I have a kidney stone, so I'm going to go to the urologist. Well, do I need to do another x-ray, or how do they have access to that, or do I have to get it, or whatever? So this idea of shared medical records is interesting from a medical standpoint, but the question is, how does that influence my medical seeking behaviors, perhaps? Especially if I'm seeking medical treatment or potential medical treatment for a events that have social stigma tied to it. So let's say that I'm concerned that I have some sort of sexually transmitted disease, but I'm been married for a long time, I'm very active in my church, and my primary care physician sets 2 pews in front of me, right? So I want to go someplace else, but then when I come back, does that person have access to information I don't want them to have access to? So does it change my behaviors? Well, I could be interested in that and create a bunch of items about health-seeking behavior as it relates to medical records, right? And then I could go over to the clinic and ask people to fill out those scales or those items. But if I've never created a scale, that is, or I've never done the literature review or identified what scales exist, how can I publish on something that I don't really know what I measured? That is, I actually put all of the information into SPSS, and I can actually create statistically a scale that is not theoretically based. That is, I just put a bunch of items together because I've run a reliability analysis. It shows me that they correlate with each other. I have good internal consistency, but I don't know what I've measured. I don't know what to call it, right? And that I was part of that study. I was the statistician on that study. And I don't know how old that data is, but it wasn't published. But it was right after David Kendrick got the big $13 million Beacon grant. Great timing for us to do the study, but we don't know what to call it because we didn't do the literature review. Start with theory. Theory should drive research, right? Data shouldn't drive research. That's what I'm saying. Let the scientific method play out. Any questions, comments? Sure, and actually I'm glad that you said that. One of the databases that we have access to, I believe, is Test in Print. It's I don't want to call it a journal, it's really more of an annual book that comes out. There's also another one called Mental Measurement Yearbook. And those have historically been on reserve over in our library system. So we could always go to those 2 sources. My guess is there's probably more than just those. Those are the 2 I'm familiar with as a psychologist.
What was the first one you said?
Test in Print.
Test and Print.
Test in Print.
Test and Print.
And then Mental Measurement Yearbook. And usually what they'll present is a 2-page or a couple of pages summary of the article or of the measure and its psychometric validity and reliability estimates, and then how to access the, whether it's proprietary or free use or whatever. More and more disciplines are putting out books of their own measures, but those are 2 areas. And then each discipline probably has journals that are associated with measurement. So in psychology, we have journals like Educational and Psychological Measurement that does nothing but validity and reliability estimates on measures, right?
Library has a handout on test and measurement databases and books and stuff, so I will bring that on Fridays if you're interested.
Yeah. I actually, what I would say is if you're brand new and you don't know, probably one of the best places to start is just to go over to the library and ask what resources are available to me. Because they can actually show you where they are in the section, but probably walk you through our databases on how to find them as well. You don't have to work in isolation. There's enough support there, right? Okay. Thank you. So, pretty hardcore, boring lecture style yesterday. A little more hands-on today in terms of finding them. Friday, we'll actually say, okay, we've collected data. Now, how do we analyze our own data relative to validity and reliability? Okay, it's not going to be a statistics session. And again, there's no assumption that you've ever had a statistics course or a methods course on Friday. We'll actually just show you how to analyze that information. Okay? So once again, lot more people showing up than I ever expected when you talk about reliability or statistics. As a statistician, as a quantitative psychologist, I'm usually the only party animal in the room. So I will try to tell you a bunch of stat jokes that you can take to parties on Friday because it is the weekend, and so we'll make it worthwhile for you. So anyway, I'll stick around if you have any questions, but otherwise, thank you very much for your patience and sticking it out. Again, there's plenty of food.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.